let's do that. So I clicked on record. If you like, I can upload it. Less hassle for you. Or
okay. If you can send me the file, because you are the host, so I can't record on my end unless you send me permission. So if you just, you can just, Dropbox or Google Drive the file to me, and I'll upload it on my channel as well.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Let's do that. Well, what should we talk about?
Well, I'd like to broach a topic with you because I'm trying to enter into a bunch of discussions around this topic, and I thought you would be a really good person to talk to. It's sort of the main theme that my series is oriented towards, and that my channel is building towards. And of course, I touched upon it in this series, which is the modern relationship, or the current relationship. Modern's now a question term. So let's call it the current relationship between science and spirituality. And I think Heidegger has a lot to say about that. I think he does. And I was wondering, and I know that you and Guy have been talking about that. And I imagine that when the three of us talk, not that long, and I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. This will give sort of maybe some preliminary work. Like, we don't need to resolve anything or anything pretentious like that today, but get the topic going, and then maybe the three of us could pick it up. How does that sound as a proposal to you?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So one, I think, sort of relatively easy way to start might be with Heidegger's proposal, two proposals perhaps that are linked in my mind around this question. Yeah. The one proposal is that the history of Western metaphysics is basically the history of nihilism.
Yeah.
And then the other proposal is that this is not just an epistemic ontology, but it's actually woven into our environmental ontology in terms of technology. The idea of the way technology has basically inframed us in that ontology, put the world in a standing reserve. And it seems to me those themes are very relevant to this relationship between science and spirituality in the current time. And as you know, I touched upon those, at least the first one, a little bit the second one, but I touched upon the first one in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear what your thoughts are. If you think it's fair for me to bring those 2 points together, if they're relevant to this topic, and then what some of your initial thoughts are on that.
Yes, I think very relevant. As you know, Heidegger speaks of Gestell as the essence of technology, which often is translated as framing, or you could translate also as positionality or positioning, or the concentration of all forceful, demanding positioning, so that everything is turned into a standing reserve, standing ready to be exploited for the sake of something else. That's the will to will that kicks in, right? A will that wills itself. You can kind of see also cybernetics, a positive feedback loop that kicks in here as well. And that's what capital functions like, etc. That always runs in parallel. So so Heidegger himself says in an interview with Richard Wisser in the late 60s, that he's not against technology. He doesn't oppose it. Ich bin nicht gegen die Technik. I'm not against technology. He doesn't speak of the demon in technology, of something evil that's occurring there. It's simply he just tries to understand its meaning. And he actually also says that he sees a prelude in technology to what he calls Ereignis, to the event. So that's a very interesting quote. That's something maybe we can pick up at some other point too, because that's it's really weird. But anything that Heidegger, when he starts publicly, and this is also very important, I think, then Heidegger becomes a sort of a public intellectual, because the idea, of course, of Heidegger is he sits in his hut. I mean, he lived there when they were younger and they had no money, but they didn't live there. He lived in Freiburg and with his family, and then later on back in Meeskirchen, his hometown. But he did spend time in the hut, of course, throughout his life. But he was also so as he starts working or thinking through the meaning of technology and its origin, he begins to be very public. So he gives the talk on the question concerning technology at the Technical University of Munich to an audience of engineers. And he gives talks on traditional language and on original language and technical language to teachers, to high school teachers. So simply to professionals who will then go out into the world and have to make sense of what's going on. But everything he writes on technology and framing, Gestell, etc., is always in parallel with his writings on the Geviert, which is a weird German word. It means, it's usually translated as fourfold, or the four regions of mortals, us, earth, sky, and gods, which are or remain unnamed. But you cannot have one without the other. So in framing, Gestell runs almost in parallel. These are two different dimensions. We're kind of in at the same time. So you can't have one without the other. And this is what you would say the technological and the spiritual are.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. So I was taught to translate it as end framing, and that you said that's an okay translation, right? Right. So the idea is the positioning. Am I to understand this, that this gets into both of these modes that you've described, the fourfold and the technological and framing? Like I want to try and translate that into more phenomenological terms for people. What does that mean for people? Like to say that like when you say, everything is put at a standing reserve, that sounds like a purely conceptual thing, but that's deeply not Heidegger's point, right? Heidegger's point is, I take it to be something along the lines, it's sort of woven into our cultural cognitive grammar in a very profound way, so that it's almost transparent to us. It's kind of almost like the lens through which we're seeing ourselves and seeing the world.
Yeah.
Is that an appropriate way of talking about it?
It's good. So transparent, I've not thought of that term before, but it's so transparent that we don't see it.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So that's the trouble. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. When you say it's transparent, it has to do, I think, with perspective. And it's not just it's not about a concept. So Heidegger does not want to give us a concept by which to understand. He says the way that beings now appear to us, as for example, an airplane or a chicken.
Yeah.
There's almost there is no difference, because they both, on some different level, just stand ready to serve some means. So it's all, in a different terminology, you could say it's all,
and we do, right? You think of like human resource departments at the university, right? We are resources, right? And there's all this idea, and Fromm talked in a similar manner about the marketing character, how we're sort of self-promoting commodities.
Yes. We're also under neoliberalism, we're each, we have our own brand, and the funny thing, of course, we have to play with that a bit to get into and then kind of from within, which is, you can play with that matrix, but only, I think, if you see it, right? If you purely think of yourself as a resource, you will be exploiting yourself, and that's violent language. So there's a certain violence in that too. Heidegger says herausfordern. So in opposition to, and this is a literal opposition to because he wants us to come back to a primordial understanding of nature, which is, as you know, is physis. The Greek notion. So Heraclitus says, "Physis cryptis tai philae." Nature likes to hide herself. We can't see nature, but the way we understand nature is that we use it as a tool for our means. And that has to do, to come at this from a totally different perspective, from Hegel, for example, that has to do with human freedom. So we are free to do so. That's kind of our emancipation. And of course, the current discourse on and deep ecology, environmentalism, etc., recognizes that there's something profoundly at odds between us and nature. What I think what we can read from out of Hegel and out of Heidegger is that nature must have its own essence. It must be allowed to be in its own terms, in its own right. And to some degree, this means that nature is not fully accessible to us. And that comes back to, we can talk about,
does that switch on the accessibility of nature? Does that correspond to a switch in us? What I mean is, we have in a kind of an egocentric, in which we're thinking of everything of how it's in service to us, and rather, you know, and I don't mean sort of at an everyday level, but at a deeper level in the way in which we might be in service. So let me explain what I mean. Like previous cultures saw their, you know, their soul, their who they are, a person was their ultimately their being in service to God, right? The direction of the ontology, the direction of service was ontocentric rather than egocentric. So is that switching in the accessibility of nature, does it also bring with it like an inversion or a reversal of that orientation of service?
Yeah, definitely. That's the tragedy of modernity as a whole, I would say. That's the trajectory that all of modernity is on. That's what. So you know, people talk about accelerationism, capital, whatever you want to call it. What this is, there is a certain explosion that takes place in knowledge production.
Yes.
And also a literal explosion in terms of human beings. And
also in power. I mean, literal physical power. Our ability to exert power on the earth is tremendous now.
Yes, but every time we exert power, we deny that there's something that remains hidden and concealed, and that pushback that'll come to haunt us, right? It's like the outside it's the underworld that all of a sudden will flip, and the sheer horror will begin to show itself. But modernity begins, and you can call whatever you call this. It has to do with power, an explosion of power and intelligence, yes. And that explosion kicks off, I would say, when the telos is abandoned. So teleology, Francis Bacon explicitly gets rid of the telos. That's that it was an impediment to the sciences for 2,000 years. So he blames Aristotle for having come up with and everything explodes, right? So there's a wonderful book by Alexander Quire, which is not much read today, which is From the Closed World, or From the Cosmos to the Infinite Universe.
Right, yes.
And of course the multiverse. So you can see these explosions in all directions. We're exploding towards the, you know, infinite multiverses, but we're also exploding further and further down into the subatomic quant level and whatever levels. So that explosion goes in all directions. We can mash up everything. And I think there's the Descartes kind of articulated is that the ego is at the center of this, a self-referential ego that simply is holding on to itself and only to itself.
The contact is only on itself, right? The contact with the world that's so central in the Aristotelian worldview has withdrawn into the cogito, right? The kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's exactly this, right? It's just, but when you read the meditations, right, from a scholarly perspective, but simply as from a common sense, even from a common sense perspective, you read it, it's some of it is really violent, right? Quite cruel. It says, I'm looking outside. I don't even know if these people are real. They could just be machines and robots. What do I know? And then the only way that he can come back outside into the world is because God guarantees that there's some kind of interdependence between Cogitans and res extensa.
But that's ultimately even putting God in service, right? God's ultimate function is an epistemic function, right? God's there to as guarantor of my truth claims ultimately, which is like, again, this part of this huge inversion. Like rather than God representing the inexhaustibleness of the sacred depth, God is now this perfect guarantor of my assertions, which is like, that's such a huge inversion.
Yes, it's it's good. You yes, I can just say yes, it's true. because when you look, you know, the way we can look at this now, and coming back to Quire's book, From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe or something, the book ends with an anecdote from Napoleon and Laplace. Laplace presents to Napoleon his model of the universe, which is pure like a clockwork. Napoleon asks Laplace, but where is God? And he says, I no longer need this hypothesis.
Need that hypothesis.
And God is already a hypothesis, the master of the clockwork in Descartes and in Bacon. It's already there. And that's perhaps also what Nietzsche refers to when he speaks of the death of God. How were we capable of doing this is precisely because the inexpressible, or the inexhaustible, like the exuberance of the divine, that's totally gone. Heidegger says somewhere, the God of metaphysics, and I think you point this out as well in some of the lectures, the God of metaphysics is not a God you can sing and dance for.
Yeah.
It's not a God you fall down on your knees in awe. It's the causa sui, that means the self-causing cause. That is just an hypothesis. It's nothing that could inspire. There's nothing dangerous about this God.
Well, there's nothing that will give you an aphoretic challenge to cause you to aspire to some deep transformation. And I mean, there's a couple points I want to make here and see what you think about that. One, that seems to me to be the culmination, right, of the idea that we can do theology, talk about God, without having to undergo any kind of deep transformation. The next one is, so I'll just list these and then you can respond to them at length. You talk about this explosion, but it seems to be inherently bound up with this exploitation that we've also been talking about. So while we're getting a quantitative increase, there's kind of a shallowing going on. I was thinking when you was talking about that, I was thinking about Hahn's critique, his critique of Foucault. He said, you don't need huge oppressive systems because we have an framing in which self-exploitation is our fundamental way of being. You know, he talks about that whole achievement. We're just working to work because things work, because that's how they work, because technology works, and it's all that sort of spinning. And I thought that was something you might want to talk about. And then maybe gather that together back towards, because I feel it's now looming on the horizon of our discussion, which is the history of metaphysics, is the history of nihilism, where that doesn't mean the coming to the fore of a particular ideological position. It means something more like this, you know, this modal emptying of our capacity to get to the depths of ourselves and the world, things like that. So those are sort of 3 points you can play with. Have fun.
Very good points. A lot to play with there, because when you said the first point was, so we can talk about theology. Actually, that's what we've been doing, right?
Yes, very much.
So what I mean by this is the explosion works on all levels. There's an explosion of knowledge and an explosion of historical data. Like we have access to everything. That's extremely odd, because while we have this extreme access to all kinds of data points and information, at the same time we seem to be cut off from something rather crucial, which is genuine experience of something divine, religion. So we can look at all the different religions across all civilizations. We can find more and more and more. But it seems like we get less and less access to the divine. A short story I sometimes like to mention by E.M. Foster is The Machine Stops, which describes 1910, I think, more than 100 years ago.
Story.
So people live on the ground, and all they do is they're connected, like us now, online, and they talk about ideas. The word idea is all over the place. They talk about ideas of all the, for example, music in Aboriginal Australian culture. Now, all of this can be very interesting and enlightening on some level, but it's never it doesn't get to, and this is why I think why he makes, gives the metaphor of some people living underground. It's because they're no longer even on the earth. And
there's an allusion to Plato, right? I took it to be an allusion to Plato's allegory there.
Exactly. That's the cave. And I think that we live basically through the cave.
Right.
Beginning to show itself, right? That there's some truth to what philosophy is trying to tell us. And so the same counts, of course, for philosophy itself, right? We've never had, so philosophy is not dying actually in academia. So yes, it's getting defunded all over the place, but there are more philosophers probably now than ever before. And there's all kinds of historical engagement with any kind of philosophical school that there ever was. But the question is there a genuine access to these experiences? This is something Heidegger says again and again. You can read all of this, but you have to have made the experience. If the experience is lacking, then it's kind of a simulacrum of the real thing.
This was part of Hadot's critique too, right? I mean, I think that was one of his main ideas. Sorry for interjecting, but I thought that was an important connection point.
Yes, and this is something that I think Heidegger and Nietzsche himself, just by the way he lived, showed us that if without it being genuine, what we begin to do is we begin to look back and just apply, is it this kind of ism or is it that kind of ism? There's a very short note by Heidegger in a book that I think it's volume 14 or 13. I'm not quite sure anymore. It's just 5 sentences. And it's an introductory remark he added to the Holzweg, to Off the Beaten Track, in the 50s or 60s. And that short paragraph, he says something very weird. He says, the history of metaphysics has not, has fulfilled itself, has come into fulfillment, but we're now, only just now, we have to come to terms with it. So we are now facing what metaphysics has tried to grapple with. And I think that's what we're living through, right? Because he says technology is an extension of metaphysics. Yes. And this is what we're trying to make sense of. And I think, frankly, that this is why people come and watch your stuff, for example, is because it's not, is it this kind of ism or is it that kind of ism? But no, it's trying to read from all of what's coming there as a wave that's coming from behind and all of it coming at us. It's coming back at us, and we're trying to make, so meaning crisis. What's a meaning crisis? There's something at stake, meaning itself. That means, so the question, right? The question of being is the question for the meaning of being. So we're trying to reconnect, and we're trying at the same time, not just to look back at, oh, Descartes argued this and Bacon argued this. No, we're trying to make sense for what is coming.
Yes. Yeah.
And
oh, sorry, I told you I'd let you play, but I want to. So I mean, I think there's a point here that I think that should be emphasized, right? This isn't, because I sometimes hear this accusation of Heidegger, and I don't know if it's fair of Heidegger. It doesn't seem to me it is, but regardless, it's not fair to my thinking. So I want to state that, which is, all of this argument is not an argument for nostalgia. It's not like people who somehow just, well, I'll just reject the scientific worldview, as if like they don't get how permeated, like the way we've been talking about, how permeated it is into our ontology, our way of framing, the salience landscaping we do, our concepts of identity. Notice the level we've been talking about. We haven't been talking about this at the level of, well, I just won't use this tool, or I don't believe in the theory of evolution. We're not talking about science at that level. We're talking about it, as you said here, as the culmination of a particular metaphysical history.
Yeah.
And you can't just, oh, well, let's just reject all that. That's not being argued for here. That's what I want to claim, at least.
Yes, and I mean that would be the very violent project of the Futurismo, the futurist movement out of Italy, from the early 20th century. They wanted to burn down everything that was left of Rome and kind of bury it under a level of concrete, and make way for the future. But science itself, or the scientific worldview, is just that. It is a worldview. It's not absolute. It's not total, I would say.
Of course. I don't
deny
that.
Certain presuppositions. So when Heidegger, for example, says science does not think, he says that's not a criticism. That means that science itself is just a methodology. As soon as the scientist begins to think, for example, the physicist begins to think about certain particles, that physicist is a metaphysician.
Yes.
It's already on a different level. It begins to be philosophy.
Yes.
And it's not about certain beliefs that you believe in evolution or anything like that. No, I think it's what are the presuppositions of, and what out of what is something arising, and without knowing where this comes from, there cannot be this revolution in thought or consciousness, to speak with Hegel, that people are after at the moment. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, and that's sort of, I mean, for me, that point and the second point I gave you to play with are deeply interwoven. I take, Hans' critique to be that, this is permeated so deeply into us that, and it's bound up with other things, our Protestant heritage, etc. But that whole idea that we're in a fundamental mode of self-exploitation, which I thought was kind of a really profound insight, and how we've been sort of terrified, and this, it's so short in The Agony of Ecstasy, right? The Agony of Eros, sorry. There's this little tiny 3-page critique of Foucault, but I thought, I thought it was one of the most brilliant things I've seen. It's like, no, we don't, it's not so much, he basically says we don't need the panopticon state, because all we have to do has deeply internalized and identified with self-exploitation, and we will just work ourselves to death for capitalism. right? And that's what I mean about, you can't just sort of say, oh, well, I'm not going to, it's in the way we work. It's in the way we, right? It's in the way we think about ourselves.
Yeah.
That's how profound it is.
Yes. So it's not coming from the outside.
That's right. That's right. That's
not, so the panopticon is us.
Yes.
Literally
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
We're watching ourselves. We're objectifying ourselves. An
Yeah.
experience becomes real when we put it up on Instagram.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And then ultimately, for all that technological connectedness,
Yeah.
the loneliness and the radical discontent it breeds within people,
Yes.
right? That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
And that's why I think these weird conversations that we're having online
Yeah.
are
So
exploding too.
Yeah.
Because this is not scripted.
No.
We've talked once before for an hour, which wasn't recorded, and
Yep.
we'll have other conversations. But I didn't email you anything. Like, what do you want? No, nothing. There's nothing. It's just happens or it doesn't happen.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? But there's something about so experience, and so looking at Han and this kind of this is a positive.
Yeah.
But there's also something. So the self-exploitation is the self doing it to itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's nothing coming from the outside. This is why, and framing, yes, but this is us doing it. So it's position. Sure. So what is being? Being is very simply ens qua ens. That's Latin. Beings as beings. Being is the as. Being is just in the as. So beings show up as standing reserve. That's being. Being is not some magical entity that's godlike and floating around doing something. It has to do with a hermeneutics that is historical, that is larger than us, that overcomes us, and we're thrown, as Heidegger would say, thrown into it, and then have to make sense.
Right.
And as so we cannot, it's not like a toolbox. We can reconfigure being itself at will, but we can see that there are other dimensions, other areas within being, right, within this interpretation of beings, that all of a sudden it no longer just is a standing reserve, but that has to do, I think, with accepting death and finitude, because this logic of self-exploitation for the sake of self-exploitation, etc., what that always blinds out is limitation, finitude.
Exactly, it blinds that out. I just wanted to just again, because I want to be careful about the uptake of certain of these terms. I think it's completely right to use the word hermeneutic and interpretation. But again, you're not describing something that is just or even focally cognitive. It's not that kind. I mean, there's a cognitive dimension to it, but we're talking about this, like this hermeneutics is in, well, sort of the grammar of your existential moding, right? It's not, well, what he meant there when he talked about hermeneutics is, and I sit back and I reflect and I think and I come up with it. We're not talking about that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, well, something that, if you'll allow me my language, and I use Dreyfus as a bridge from Heidegger to this language, I think this, this gets down into the guts of our relevance realization machinery, that fundamental process by which, our agency in the world and salience landscaping, what stands out and how it stands out for us. As you said, the way things are, beings coming to be as particular beings. I think that I'm talking about that level. I'm not talking, well, that I think you are too. We're talking about that kind of the hermeneutics that constitutes our agency, not the hermeneutics that is after our agency is sort of established and we do some reflective stuff. Is that fair?
Yes, because this is what Heidegger already points out in Being in Time, as you know, is that the hermeneutic circle isn't sitting down and writing something and then reinterpreting some texts. No, the Dasein itself, right? The openness to being, to that beings appear as something, right? The tree can be a source of energy. The tree can also be the tree of life in the Bible. These are totally different ontologies almost, but the hermeneutic circle is the way that Dasein is in the world.
Exactly.
This is how we exist, and exist has to do with time, and all of this comes in. But yeah, it's not. It's much deeper than just the reflective.
Right. Good.
Reflective is what modernity wants us to do, right? That's what Descartes wants us to do. To
exactly.
Everything and put everything into doubt methodologically to arrive at some absolute certainty. And that is what Heidegger pulls the rug under from the beginning. That's what he pulls that away and says the only certainty Dasein can have is death.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, it's a bit of a, a bit brutal maybe, but I think, so the cogito ergo sum, which takes modernity on its trajectory, is countered by Heidegger when he says sum moribundus, I am because I am towards my death.
Mm-hmm.
And this being towards this ultimate horizon is what then grants meaning, because when you begin to see the finitude of everything, anything.
But that's the word I wanted to pick up on.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So when people hear this, they hear just the finality of death. They don't hear the finitude of mortality. And those aren't, I mean, they're not disconnected from each other, but you shouldn't reduce the latter to the former, right? The fact that we're in the finitary predicament, as Cherniak talks about it, is really, really fundamental to I in fact argue this extensively. That's fundamental to our capacity of making meaning, at least meaning in life kind of meaning. That we don't have that, if we weren't in the finitary predicament, we wouldn't be cognitive agents at all. It's right. It's in the very guts of our ability to make sense.
Yeah. Yes, we couldn't. There would be, simply because there would be nothing to project. So death establishes this ultimate horizon, and against which horizons just light up and begin to make sense. And there is something. The weird thing is to get across that it's not morbid, it's not pessimistic or anything like this. It's to say that look at a wonderful moment that just so occurs. A red letter day, as the British say.
Yeah.
That just occurs, but it also occurs because bound up with it is already its limitation, its ending. It will end. This day will end, and then it becomes a memory. But it isn't nothing that would just extend out forever.
Yeah.
As a nunc stans, a standing now, could have this kind of exuberant beauty.
I tried to get into that when I tried to bring in one of the lectures, that Buddhist notion of, the horror of immortality. Like, oh, I want to live. No, you don't. Right? Like, it's a real challenge, because I tend to think, of a salience landscape, almost topographical, right? And then if you stretched it out, right, you would sort of lose all the topography, and you would get the absolute flatness of kind of an absolute nihilism. Because why would anything matter more than anything else? Why would you do one thing? Exactly. All of it goes away. So, I mean, I wonder if there's because I know Heidegger didn't pick this up, but there seems to be a little bit of I might be overreading, but some allusions in Tillich towards this, that there's a deep complicity between sort of the project of immortality and this kind of forgetfulness that we're talking about, right? The idea that this project is the ultimate project is for me to live forever, and that. Right, and so you see what I'm suggesting. This is not a well worked out thesis, but we're talking here. There's an idea here that there's a hidden complicity between the immortality project and nihilism, the emergence of nihilism. That's what I'm suggesting.
Absolutely, I think that's more work, more brain power needs to go into that suggestion, that idea, that trajectory, because that's absolutely the case. I think. But we're trying to find out why. Immortality and increasing nihilism, or the crisis of meaning collapsing, is absolutely there. Now, why is that? We could come at it simply from Hegel, for example. We could say life that doesn't phase up to death is just sheer immediacy. And sheer immediacy, he says it in the Phenomenology, sheer immediacy is just sheer givenness. And once you live in sheer givenness and there's no resistance, there's no opposition to you, then everything becomes again flat, right? And Nietzsche says something goes, because we're riffing off here. But so Nietzsche says the last man lives longest. He flattens the earth. So this idea of flattening the earth and living longest.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And life Hegel says the full life that breathes itself, subsumes death and strides through death, because that's negativity. So without negativity, you only live in sheer immediacy, but immediacy must be mediated, and it's mediated through negativity. You can also say that, look, education, something we both care about deeply.
Very much.
Education is not something you can consume. There's a struggle.
Yes.
And struggle means there's something that's resisting. There's something that you don't understand. There you are. That's negativity. So you have to stride through what you don't know. And then you get to a place where you begin to know. But that's not something you can just download into your brain, because, the advocates of transhumanism, for example, who want to live forever, have digital immortality, for them everything is just a given. It's like the Matrix. Oh, Neo, do you know how to fight? No, we'll just upload it to your brain. And you can't, like, that's, if there is no struggle, there's no pushback. Would you learn how to walk?
Yeah.
You need to learn how to walk by getting up and falling back down and getting up again, and until you know how to walk.
Okay, so there's two riff points that come out for that of me. One is because I'm doing the work on the After Socrates project, and we've lost the role of the aporetic, right? We've lost the importance of aporia, right? We've lost the importance of aporia. So that, I think, points direct, and how central that is to dialogic reasoning as opposed to monologic reasoning. Because we keep doing this. We sort of get to, and like we even have these little momentary aporias that then they get folded back in.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, I think I lost my other point. Oh, geez, it was a good one too. There was the aporetic, the loss of that. And I was trying to think about something you said. Oh, yes. And then that gets that. Now I remember. Thank you. This brings, because I alluded to Tillich, and Tillich has that idea, right? It's a Hegelian, but it's also post-Hegelian, that the God beyond the God of theism is the God that always is taking non-being back into himself, right? And I thought, which is like, and I don't think that people get how radical. I mean, I think the Kyoto school, and they got, oh wow, this is a really radical thing he's doing. He's proposing a deep kind of non-theism, right? Because he's saying, I think, right, that we should give up a perfectionist model of God, that God is a finished completeness, right, and that we should stop trying to achieve, that kind of everlasting completeness or perfection. That is a fundamental, inappropriate framing of the divine, because he was dealing with the meaning crisis. I mean, that's clearly the case in The Courage to Be. And he was saying, like, we've got to fundamentally break out of that way of thinking in a deep, deep way. So I gave you sort of two things to play with there on that one. We still have to get back to the history of metaphysics as the history of knowledge. But I think we're kind of doing it.
Yes. So Aporia.
Yeah.
Socratic notion. And this is, I think, also important, just as an aside on Heidegger. Heidegger does not does not deconstruct, does not want to get rid of metaphysics or any of the texts. No, it's just a rereading and picking up on something that's lost in the tradition, which has to do with this forgetfulness and the oblivion of being. There's so much that comes together. And he says, for example, in a letter to one of his friends, that Heraclitus is right behind him.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's a metaphor, but aporia is a wonderful notion, because it can mean, of course, being perplexed by some logical argument or something that doesn't really conclude, or it just means what it means, which is roadlessness.
Yeah, exactly.
No longer a road.
Yeah.
And that, of course, just by association is reminiscent of Heidegger's Holzwege, of off the beaten track, of going into the woods, of finding your own path. So the roadlessness isn't just a perplexing collapse of all meaning. It actually is an invitation. It's an invitation to find it. Just like Being in Time ends on a question. Some people read this book and then, oh, it's all collapsing. I don't know. Why didn't he write the second version? When I finished reading it, I thought, wow, it ends on a question. Could it be that perhaps time, right? Because he doesn't conclude, it leaves it open. And by this leaving open, in this aporia, in this roadlessness, one has to go off and find your own path. So you have to not repeat anything that someone has said, but you go off, and from out of what you're reading, you begin to find new paths. And I think the meaning crisis itself, or nihilism, is that sort of on the one hand, is this meaning itself disappearing, but an invitation at the same time for it to make a comeback if we respond to that current situation appropriately.
Oh, and there's lots of people I'm in discussion with, not just philosophical discussion, but people who are building communities of practice, who are taking that up. I mean, they might not articulate it technically as clearly as you and I are doing right now, and that's not meant as a criticism of it all, but they're out there, real time and talent. It's like, no, there's a kind of fundamental transformation, a reorientation.
There we are. I hope that.
What happened there? You lost signal?
I think so. Yeah, sure. Sorry. I hope it was recorded.
That's okay. We'll just edit that out. You had sort of come to a complete thought there, which was good.
Yeah.
But Aporia, I was trying to also. I was just saying that, there's people out there that are doing exactly what you say. They're sensing the kairos. They're sensing the opportunity, and they're responding to it again, not primarily propositionally, but in a much more existentially pervasive and profound sense. I also wanted to know what because I see that Sarah Albo-Rappe's book on Socratic wisdom and Platonic knowledge, and the role of Aporia for waking people up, for making them sort of remember the being mode, remember that they are the beings whose being is in question, remember that they, in addition to all of their knowings, they have an awareness of themselves as knowers, and and this sort of profound, right, that are you still there?
Yeah.
You cut out for a sec. That sort of profound realization that we, right, that we have, Heidegger seems to talk about it, that we have a kind of responsibility that the other things we encounter don't have, because we are the beings whose being is in question. So what I'm trying to say, I guess clumsily, is I'm trying to say that what Aporia does is wake you up to the fact that you are the being whose being is in question. And that means to me that I think there's a deep connection. It's not just happenstance, or it's not just historical. There's a deep connection between Aporia and dialogue. Right? Because dialogue is a much more powerful way for us to bring ourselves into question, right? Because of the way we can question and quest, we can question each other and quest together beyond, our sort of stable conceptualizations. So I think there's a deep connection between dialogue and Aporia. I think they sort of really need each other, because you see that, right? It's sort of the Socratic induction of Aporia. Like, people have all of these, they have this machinery that we've been talking about throughout our whole conversation that protects them from waking up in kind of a pernicious manner, right? And right, yeah, exactly, right. And you need, and one of the things that dialogue does, I mean, I'm sort of riffing on the opposite of Sartre's idea that hell is other people, but other people are openings, right? Opening, right? Go ahead. I've kept you.
Can you say, because can you say a bit more on what's stopping people to wake up? I want to hear more.
So like I said, I think, part of it, what we're talking about, is, and I mean, there's this long argument in Awakening about this deep historical, cultural, cognitive grammar that kind of frames us. And when I do that, in my mind, I'm thinking of, by analogy, right? Things like the 9-dot problem, where we have a framing of the problem, and it fundamentally prevents us from seeing what needs to be seen. I'm using it in that sense. And so we have this kind of profound cultural cognitive grammar and our way of being in the world, and it's monologic, it's self-exploitation, it's self-speaking, and I'm ultimately talking to myself because all that I touch is myself, cogito, it's all this.
Yeah.
What dialogue can do, if it's dialogos and not just discourse,
Yes.
is it can induce aporia, because that's what the Socratic encounter is in my mind. You get this person who comes in, it looks like they're going to do discourse with you, and then he goes, aha, right? He does this thing where, and then suddenly there's aporia, and then you wake up to you wake up to the aspirational challenge. You wake up to the fact that you are the being whose being is in question. That's the Socratic moment par excellence in my mind. That is that. I take it that Socrates' claim is that, and that alone can motivate you to true philosophy. Anything else is kind of an intellectual curiosity or desire. It's philonikeia. It's a desire to manipulate or win arguments, but only when you wake up to you are the being whose being is in question, then and only then can you pursue wisdom in a deep fashion. That's what I mean about the deep connection between dialogos, and waking up.
And I would add to that, language itself is, of course, at once the greatest danger, and on the other hand, also what could lead to an awakening. There's a wonderful quote, which I only can paraphrase, from Osip Mandelstam, who was a Jewish Russian author. He wrote on poetry that speech in everyday situations is automatic. We just say certain things. How are you? I'm fine. Blah blah blah, and everything's kind of just automatic, and we don't really question something. But he says poetic speech interrupts this.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. No, but that's exactly it. What I sometimes do when I'm teaching some of my students, I'll say, I don't, we're going to do some poetry. No, don't read poetry. What I want you to do for the next week is carry around a journal and catch all the metaphors you're using, and also catch all the metaphors you're enacting with your gesture.
Yeah.
See, instead of it being, let's go back to our earlier language, instead of it being transparent to you, step back. That's the Socratic moment. Step back and see it rather than automatically seeing through it. Wake up to what is it reflecting back to you about the kind of being you are, that your language is permeated and afforded by all this metaphor, both spoken and enacted. And then they wake up to the possibility of poetry. Because if you just have them start reading text, it's just, oh, well, what did the author think, right? He's writing in Victorian England. He's clearly representing blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Yeah. But you see, there's something very profound here. I mean, it's kind of funny because we're talking on the same plane, right? But because it makes us laugh, I think, because what we're seeing is that there's no thought that goes into this, and we can very quickly say, categorize. Oh, this is 18th century German poetry. This must therefore mean blah, 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 blah. And this was written in 20th century America. This must mean blah, blah, blah. So it's already formatted. There's already a format, and this is everywhere. Everything is a format. So there is this, I live in London. There are places here that you have to go visit when you're in London because they're all on Instagram. They're Instagrammable. There's a road in Edinburgh. Which is now people who live there actually now have started petitions to get people to ban people from even entering the street because it's overrun. Because people go there because you have to be there and have to get that Instagram shot. So it's already a format. Now, I mentioned before the red letter day, a day that just so occurs, that in its finitude reveals its beauty, its unique beauty for just one day for all times to come. We can now buy in the UK, I think from some company, red letter days. So we can buy the format. It doesn't even, the next step of capitalism is, of course, that you don't even do it. You just pay for it. And then why would you even do it, right? It's everywhere. I mean, romantic weekend in the countryside. You can't plan for it to be romantic. It either occurs or it doesn't. Like Eros itself, but you mentioned Hahn's book on Eros. Eros is this not fully revealedness, not full transparency. There's some concealment, there's something hidden, there's mystery. And that is
the other always withdraws in Eros to some degree, right? The other is always beyond your grasp, or it's not genuine Eros. It's just raw consumption. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word kairos before.
Yes.
What is the kairos? Is the Augenblick, the blink of an eye, that
Yeah.
you cannot will for it to occur.
No, you just any more than you can will an insight to happen. You can do things that increase your receptivity for when it might occur,
Yes.
right? And you can afford it, but you can't manufacture it. And I think that's something else we've lost. We've lost the distinction between affordance, because Heidegger uses a lot of cultivation metaphors, and we have completely lost it in the notion of manufacture, right? And there's right. We can afford a lot, right? We can afford a lot,
Yeah.
and we confuse that with what I think you're alluding to, that we can manufacture things at will.
Yeah.
I have to go soon. I mean, well, I think let's pick this up when the three of us,
Yes.
when I and Guy Senstock talk.
Very good,
I mean, there's a lot here. I'll edit out any of the parts where there was a gap.
Yeah.
Fluidity. But I think, well, I'm going to use my own language.
Yeah.
I think we afforded a lot the return to that final question about the history of metaphysics as the history of nihilism. I think we've laid a lot of affordance down for that. We could pick that up and extend the conversation with Guy, because I think he would really like that. I think he'd also like the stuff we were saying towards the end about the deep connection between aporia, the interruption, poesis, as opposed to just pronouncement. I think that would be excellent.
Yes, let's do that.
Oh, we're going to, of course, keep talking. This was such a joy, such a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. It was,
very much, very much.
It was thoroughly jazzy for me. It was
jazz,
right?
It is like jazz, isn't it?
And it should be.
Are you a musician? Do you make music?
No, it's one of the great longings of my life, because I've often been in relationship with people who are musicians. My current partner is gifted musically, and it gives her a capacity for connecting to things. I'm a poet. I write poetry.
Yeah, that's it. That's something musical. Yes.
Yeah,
I was.
And I'm a Tai Chi player, and and in Chinese it's the same verb as to play music. You play Tai Chi. So I have a deep sense of it, but I'm not myself a musician. So
but there's something poetic. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'll send you the file of it.
Yeah, and I've recorded it. I've recorded it here too.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. So I don't have to send it to you, actually.
Well, probably
not.
If I got problems on my end, but we've got redundancy, and if you want it too, like we each have it, and if the other needs it, we can send it.
Perfect. Perfect. So see you in a couple of weeks. Huh?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. This was so exciting.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Excellent conversation. Deeply fun.
Yes, I very much enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.